Okay, everybody, so now that we have Mesopotamia under our belt, let's go ahead and give you guys an introduction to Egypt. I just want you to know that I'm filming this in this weltering heat, so it is as realistic as can be. I'm outside on a nice hot day to make it just like it would be if I were filming it near the pyramids of Egypt. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is to go ahead and review what we've already talked about Mesopotamia. I know you guys just looked at this, so it shouldn't be that difficult, but go ahead and talk with somebody nearby about what each of these things are. So go ahead and pause me, and then when I come back, I will give you some insight. Okay, so you should have taken a couple of minutes and talked about these things with your partners, and it shouldn't have been too difficult. You should have noted that the Mesopotamian geography was dictated largely by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which of course were violent and unpredictable, which of course then dictated a lot about how Mesopotamian culture and their lifestyle was. Mesopotamia had a government type that was like a monarchy. It was overseen by divine kings and military kings, the most famous of which was Hammurabi. They had several different inventions, one of which was the crossbow, the composite bow, which allowed them to be more formidable fighters. They built temples called ziggurats that indicated that they were religious. They traded heavily with the people around them, which means that they were into making specialty goods. They were an empire, especially when under the rule of the Babylonians, as they took over other people that were different from them, spoke different languages, had different customs, and of course the most famous invention, I guess you could call it, or progress that they made was in writing out a law code called the Code of Hammurabi. This code, while most famous for its eye for an eye, was most important because it protected private property and sanctioned slavery. So there's some niceness in Mesopotamia. So when we look at Egypt, and what you guys are going to do today is you're going to look at it through the lens of the 5 AP World History themes. And these themes are social, political, interaction, both with the environment and between humans, cultural, and economic. And so if you want to put that into a nice little way to remember, it would be SPICE. So S, social, P, political, I, interaction, C, culture, and E, economy. You have access to and should have open a SPICE chart that's available on Schoology that looks something like this. So what you're going to do is fill out both Mesopotamia and Egypt. We're going to start with Egypt right now with me, and mostly I'm going to be talking about the interaction box, so you can go ahead and fit your attention there. That's the geographical stuff. So that's where we're going to begin. You should be able to fill out all of it on your own after I am done. So let's first talk about the geography of Africa. First, it's important to note that Africa has a huge desert right in the middle of it, the Sahara, and it sort of is the point from which we decide everything else about Africa. So you're going to hear as North Africa as a region, that would be north of the Sahara. You're going to hear of Sub-Saharan, which of course would be south of the Sahara. And so the Saharan desert, which I'll show you in just a second, is really the point of takeoff, the point of departure when talking about Africa. But really it's a huge continent, it's massive, and it has a lot of different geographical features that I will show you in a second. It's important when thinking about Africa to not think of it as monolithic, and because it is very, very different depending on where you are. So here's a traditional Pacific Rim map of the world. These maps are incredibly wrong and totally not to scale, but this is the most famous kind of map that you see. It puts the United States right in the center, which of course is not true because it's a globe, so there really is no center. But it also stretches things north to south. And what it does is it distorts the size of South America and Africa. It makes Russia, Canada, and Greenland absolutely massive. Greenland is not as big as Africa, contrary to popular belief because of these maps, and it is important that you understand that if ever looking at a map like this, it is not to scale. Rather, Africa is as big as this. China, India, the United States, as well as many Western European countries all fit inside. It's important that you note that Africa is huge. It was huge too. Is and was huge. Okay, so now when talking about the climate and therefore the geography, you'll note that Africa has a whole bunch of different stuff going on. It's kind of like the United States, only since it's bigger, I would call it more diverse. So near the top, you have this sort of desert and kind of dry and less arid area, but then the closer you get to the equator, the more you get tropical savanna and tropical rainforest. So you have the rainforest in what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and right in the middle of the continent. You also have some highlands, but you got it all going on. The Saharan desert is of course right here, and this is, like I said, the pinpoint for the rest of the continent. All right, so we're going to begin our discussion of Africa with ancient Egypt. It's important that you note that Egypt is, of course, in Africa. Egypt is oftentimes claimed as one of these like classical civilizations, sort of one of the great ancient civilizations. And I think a lot of those pro-Western people forget that Egypt is, in fact, in Africa. Guess what? It still is in Africa. So when thinking about Egypt as different than Africa, because you know it's not black people, you should come to grips with yourself and realize that, in fact, even though it is not predominantly black population, it is still in Africa. Okay, what defines ancient Egypt? It'd be the Nile River. Just like the Tigris and Euphrates define Mesopotamia, the Nile is going to define Egypt. Here is a map of what the Nile looks like. It has an upper region and a lower region. The lower region is actually further north because that is the way the river flows. So the river, different than the Mississippi River, flows south to north. Okay, so it dumps into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River Delta is one of the most fertile places in the world, especially during ancient times. Now, this is really a unique place for this river to be because, of course, it's carved out of a desert. And this area, since it was so fertile, becomes heavily settled. And if I were to look at Egypt from space even today, you will note that it is still heavily settled along the Nile. Now, the Nile was different than that of the Tigris and Euphrates because, well, it flooded reliably and predictably, which made life there a lot more stable. It wasn't as chaotic, it wasn't as tumultuous as it was in Mesopotamia. So that's the big important difference, but it also, as you recall how Mesopotamia sort of took on the personality of its rivers, Egypt does the same. It's much more calm, it's much more collected than it was in Mesopotamia. So I'm going to go ahead and play a video, and I want you to think about while you're watching this video, why is the Nile so awesome?
Shaped the worldview of the Egyptians. Let's go to the thought bubble. The Nile was regular, navigable, and benign, making for one of the safest and richest agricultural areas in the world. Each summer, the river flooded the fields at precisely the right time, leaving behind nutrient-rich silt for planting season. Planting was so easy that Egyptians just tossed seeds around the silty earth and then let their cattle or pigs walk on it to press the seeds into the ground, and then boom, grain and figs and wheat and pomegranates and melons and joy. Unlike most river valley civilizations, Egyptian communities existed only along the Nile, which was navigable enough to get valuable resources downstream, from timber to gold, which the Egyptians considered the divine metal, thereby introducing an idea that would eventually culminate in Mr. T. The Nile is also easily tamed. While other river valley civilizations needed complicated and labor-intensive hydraulic engineering projects to irrigate crops, the Nile was so chill that Egyptians could use a simple form of water management called basin irrigation, in which farmers used floodwaters to fill earthen basins and canals for irrigation. In short, the awesomeness of the Nile meant Egyptians could create big food surpluses with relatively little work, allowing time and energy for some pretty impressive projects. Also, the Nile may help explain ancient Egypt's general optimism. While ancient Sumerian religion, for instance, saw the afterlife as this gloomy, dark place, Egyptians were often buried with things that were useful and pleasurable to them in life, because the afterlife was seen as a continuation of this life, which, at least if you lived along the Nile, wasn't half bad. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And now, my dear pupils, I shall terrorize you with the oppression of death.
All right, so go ahead and take a minute and answer that question. Why was the Nile so awesome? Pause me and come on back when you think you have the answer. Okay, so hopefully you came up with something that was just about the opposite of Mesopotamia, since the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were kind of wild and unpredictable, but the Nile itself was so reliable and awesome that it allowed for the development of a much different civilization. So, so far we've had a lot of opportunities to get through several different parts of our spice chart for Egypt. So you should have something for social, something for political, something for interaction, something for cultural, and something for economic. I think that just based on our limited discussion in that short video, there should be something in all those boxes so far for Egypt. But for the rest of the class, what you're going to do is you're going to fill in this chart both for Mesopotamia and Egypt. They don't necessarily have to be comparisons or contrasts. However, those will show up organically. Now, if you don't think you have a base for knowledge yet to fill this in, go ahead and go to today's Schoology folder, and right there, that third file down, Mesopotamia and Egypt Comparison Strayer, is a reading from the textbook that you guys will receive later in the year, and that should have all your answers. So if you have any questions, go ahead and answer them yourself. Other than that, I will see you guys on Wednesday. Good luck.